stand for white domination. The nationalists stand for white domination only in what we prefer to call white South Africa.
Helen Suzman, do you agree?
There is a difference in that the National Party wants to separate South Africa into black areas and white areas, whereas the United Party is prepared to retain South Africa as one multiracial country, but it does not face the consequences thereof. Neither party, in fact, is prepared to give the black people of South Africa a meaningful say, politically, in the country as a whole.
There is no easy solution to this problem.
But there could be a more realistic solution, and that is accepting the South Africa.
Helen, your
one
realistic
country.
solution. What is your realistic solution? Realistic solution is that you put the black man in charge of South Africa.
No,
there's no slightest doubt.
But you share. There's no reason why you should supersede white supremacy by black supremacy. You can have a multiracial parliament in South Africa, surely.
Good. How are you going to do it? How are you going to do it with 16 million blacks?
But you know,
and 4 million whites?
But I think there's a great deal of goodwill still remaining among black people if whites would only make the necessary concessions from a position of power and before it's too late.
I was so shocked at what I discovered about the breakup of family life and the migratory labour system and what it did to family life among blacks that I really got interested in politics.
In the Cape Town Parliament now, there is only one spokesman for the Liberal point of view, Mrs. Helen Suzman.
It was hard work. 13 years from 1961, where all my colleagues and all the other candidates lost their seats. I only won it by 560 votes, but I was the only one to win. But I had the advantage of having had 6 years of experience in Parliament by then. I wasn't a total newcomer. I used to put something like 20 questions every session and elicit a huge amount of information. Very important, especially in times of declared emergency, when the press was not able to publish anything that was unrest-related unless it emanated from Parliament. So my questions and answers were able to be published. And then there was the social engineer of Bantustans, and that was Dr. Verwoerd, a formidable man, one of the three of the nasties, a really tough guy who just tried to put an ethical basis on everything. Brilliant, but I think totally crazy man.
En ons verdien daarvoor geen lof nie, want daar was geen ander keuse.
When he was assassinated, he was followed by Forster. Now, Forster was a different man altogether. There was no ethical nonsense as far as he was concerned about the Bantustans and the opportunities for blacks. He was just a straight, pragmatic, white domination man who was going to maintain total control over South Africa. And then, of course, he was followed by P.W. Botha, who didn't have much intellect, but had lots of determination. He was my bête noire because he was such a rude, unpleasant, unintelligent man. I could argue with Forster, we could debate. One knew what one was dealing with. But with P.W. Botha, it was all bullying.
All the other matters are extraneous. Mr. Chairman, sir, that corruption of the system.
But it was interesting enough on reflection that some very important changes took place during Botha's regime, which in fact ultimately brought down the apartheid system. I knew all about Nelson Mandela, but first time I actually contacted him was when he was already on Robben Island. I thought, well, I'm a member of Parliament, I should have access to these places. I had access earlier to jails in 1960 onwards when people were detained without trial, and I went to Pretoria to see all the Liberal people who'd been detained. And I went to see the minister, who was then Peltzer, a fairly mild gentleman, compared to the other guys that I had to deal with subsequently, like awful little Jimmy Kruger, you know, the horrible little chap who said it'll art me coat when Biko was murdered. But I asked to go, and I was given permission, and I went across on the ferry, and I met Nelson Mandela for the first time in 1967 on the island. And there was this tall, imposing man standing at the door of the cell, and we stuck my hand out, and he shook it and said, "I'm very glad you've come." And I said, "I'm very glad to meet you." And he told me the lot, that everything was made difficult. The work in the quarry was extremely hard, and they had a very tough warder in charge of them, a man who actually had a swastika tattooed on the back of his hand. And I said, "Well, I will see about that anyway." So I had a whole string of complaints, all serious ones. And when I went back, I wrote to Peltzer, thanked him for the privilege he'd given me, and said I'd like to come and talk to him. And I told him all about this warder and said, "You've got to get rid of that man. I mean, he's no business to be a warder at all. But to put him in charge of these prisoners with his political views, the man's a Nazi. You must get rid of him." Anyway, Peltzer said, "I can't get rid of him just because you say so. It'd be very bad for discipline." I said, "Well, you've got 2 weeks to get rid of him. Your vote comes up in Parliament. In those days, under the parliamentary system, every minister had to come up in turn and answer for his sins of omission and commission to Parliament. It was a wonderful system." I said, "I'll raise it under your vote, and therefore it'll be in the newspapers all over the world." He said, "Oh, Helen, you can't do that. It's dynamite." I said, "Well, I'm going to do it unless you say you're going to get rid of him." So he did get rid of him, and I was informed by one of the visitors to Nelson, I think it was his lawyer at the time, who phoned me and said to say thank you. He's gone.
Arising out of the Honourable Minister's reply, is he aware that this man has now been detained and a good deal of that time in solitary confinement for over 17 months? Will the Honourable Minister tell us when it is his intention either to charge or release this man?
Every single year, when the justice or prisons vote came up, I would either raise conditions in prison to get them improved, and or I would raise the question of release, year after year after year. I always used to be castigated by the Communist Party and the other far left that I was giving legitimacy to an illegitimate government by sitting in it. But they had no objection to using all the information I obtained by way of question and debate while in Parliament. I noticed that. I knew her as a caring social worker, and we used to go and visit the schools in Soweto, Orlando, and so on, just to show them that we were there keeping an eye on things, because there were always policemen with guns in the schoolyards, and I think it was quite a useful thing to do. And Winnie and I became quite friendly, and I used to visit her in Bromford, and whenever I went there, the special branch were always there. And I remember on one occasion I'd actually taken the trouble to get a permit from the minister, because I just had a feeling they were tightening up on her. And when I arrived, the special branch man said to Winnie, "If you don't get her out of here in 5 minutes, I'm going to arrest you." And I said, "You can't do that. I've got a permit from the minister." He said, "Ach, madam, you don't need a permit. She does." I might tell you that's the only time I've ever been really nervous of my own personal safety, because I drove back and I was followed by a car. And it was quite obvious to me that they were just following me. If I slowed down, they slowed down. If I went faster, they did. And I thought, this deserted road, it would be so easy just to drive me off the road, an accident, you know. But it's the only time I've ever really had any sort of physical fear.
In fact, though, we are a multiracial South Africa, no matter what devious methods politicians employ to try and unscramble this egg. But we are indeed a multiracial country, and we're going to remain like that.
Well, of course, if the government discovered that there were people living in areas which had been set aside for a different race group, they had absolutely no compunction about getting these people off. I mean, early on in my career, there was Sapphire Town, which was a huge thing. The United Party actually opposed that. I was still in the UP, and it was terrible. I mean, all these people were just chucked out of their houses and sent off to, somewhere miles away in Soweto. It was terrible. All over the Transvaal, people being uprooted and moved to so-called resettlement areas, which in fact turned out to be bare stretches of veldt with lots of tin latrines on them and nothing else. I mean, there were no shops, there were no schools, there were no clinics, there were no houses. They were just dumped there and made to sort of erect whatever housing they could from corrugated iron or cardboard or whatever they could find. It was a terrible phase.
The government's refusal to accept the fact that people will not just remain in impoverished rural areas where there are no job opportunities. And it's also a result of the government's refusal to accept the fact that women want to live with their husbands as a family unit, and they don't appreciate the government's policy of migrant labor, where the men come into the towns and leave the women and children behind for 11 months of the year and go home to spend a month with their families.
Well, I think it's very important to know how to use being in Parliament. First of all, you've got to work hard. It's no good just leaving your seat empty. You've got to be there to hear the arguments, and you've got to be prepared to stick your neck out and argue back, but with knowledge. So what's the legacy? The legacy is use your access and see for yourself. Don't take what the press says or what other people tell you as gospel truth. Go and verify. I think even if you're in opposition, that's very important, because I think a vigilant opposition in Parliament is one of the essentials of a sustainable democracy.